Okay, I'm going to briefly introduce myself first for those who haven't met me in real life. While I'm doing that, if you are a double reed player, could you maybe drop in the chat what country you're in, because I'm interested and nosy, and what families of instruments you mostly play, so whether it's shawms, crumhorns, Welsh fifes, that kind of thing, just so I've got an idea. Oh, Tyler's done it already, USA. Good morning, Tyler. Thank you for getting up so early. Right, okay. So I am mainly a performer and I got into reed making because it got to the point where a lot of the instrument makers and reed makers were either retired or looking at retiring. And I started to think, what's going to happen? So I started making reeds myself. And then I went from that to making reeds for the people I play with in various bands. And then having got that far, I thought, well, I probably ought to start selling them as well. And it's grown into a kind of a sideline, which I'm very grateful for this year, obviously, because I can still do it, unlike the performing. And then a few years ago, Eric, my other half, started making instruments as well. So, like I say, he's online. His profile is named Lizzie, just to be really confusing. But he can also be in the chat answering any questions you have or finding the ones that I particularly need to answer. So he's helping me. He's on the other side of the table. And he is known as the Shawm Shop, or we are together. So if you're looking for us online, it's theshawmshop.co.uk. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to start with some tips for reviving a reed that you might otherwise consider dead and finished with. The reason I'm starting at that end of the process is it's how I learned myself. So it's low risk. If you've got something that you think is otherwise ending up in the bin, you can experiment on it. You can try out a few of these things, and then we'll work backwards towards maybe some adjustments for reeds that aren't quite working for you. My intention eventually is to do a series of videos for YouTube and Facebook, going back through the process and actually looking at making reeds, but starting at the end of the process again, because that's again how I did it. So I used to buy unfinished reeds from an instrument maker called Cronin and finish them off. And then I started buying blanks and putting them together and eventually started shaping my own cane as well. So the other thing, I've got a separate camera here, which I'm going to switch over to when I'm working so that you can see my hands. So when my face disappears, hopefully, you will be able to see what I am doing. Let's try that now. There we go. So this is me here. And we're going to have a look, first of all, like I say, at some dead reeds and see if we can revive them. Let's have a look actually at, oh, we've got Russia, got lots of UK. Did you spot any other exotic places, Eric, as they went past? Okay, and we've got some crumhorns. Bagpipe reeds, I've never made bagpipe reeds. My bagpipes run on plastic, which means that they are fairly low maintenance. But a lot of the techniques we'll look at will also work on cane bagpipe reeds if need be. Kirtle and Shawm are fairly similar. Capped reeds are ever so slightly different, but again, a lot of this does apply. Right, we're going to start then with, like I say, reviving a dead reed, and we're going to do it in two halves. We're going to look first of all at the processes you need to do while the reed is still dry, and then we're going to soak it and look at some things that you can do while it's soaked, because obviously once you've got it wet, it's quite hard to go back without leaving it alone for a while. So if I've got a reed that I thought wasn't working at all, the first thing I would probably do is actually to have a look down the tube of it. Now this one's very obviously not going to be in a great state because the binding's coming off. I don't know how well you can see that. In fact, I can pull it and you can see the binding is entirely coming apart. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually glue that back on. I've been saving this reed for you guys. It's been in a box for about 6 weeks, ready for this very occasion. So I'm just going to tuck that back on, and I'm literally going to use some super glue. If need be, you could even cut some of the excess thread off. And then we're going to pop it upside down. The main trick with this actually is to find somewhere to put it where it doesn't glue itself to the table while it's drying. So what I'm going to do is get one of my little jam jars ready. There we go. And when I've glued it, I'm going to use a piece of plastic called a plaque. I'm going to stick that in between the blades. In fact, I'll do it now, and that will allow me to just pop that there while it dries. And when it comes to super glue, my favourite stuff is this Loctite, simply because it comes in a bottle that has got a little narrow pipe on it, which means I can dispense very small quantities. If you can't get this stuff, what I have seen done is to actually put the super glue onto some paper and then almost use the paper as a brush, so you can almost sort of wipe it onto where you need it to go. But I'll just glue this back together. It's got squeezy sides, this bottle, so relatively generous with it all the way around. And that's going to sit there and dry out for a bit. We'll come back to that one in about 3 minutes when it's dry, because there's something else that needs doing to it soon. Okay, so that's our first quick fix. That's also worth doing if you find that the Turk's head bit is moving up and down. So sometimes the wire that's under there will become loose, and because you can't get in there to tighten it because with the pliers because it's covered in thread, the simplest thing to do is just push it back on and do exactly the same thing. Super glue around the base there, pop it to dry, and that should then stay in place. I've actually put this reed because it has the same problem on the upper wire. So this wire here, I can move it up and down slightly with my fingers. So I'm going to show you how to tighten that as our next thing. Now I'm going to put this on a mandrel while I do it. That's one of these. It's quite simply a piece of metal that is shaped like your staple. If you haven't got a mandrel, use your staple, but be gentle. I've also got various alternatives. So this one is actually 3D printed. Eric made this one for slightly larger instruments or reeds, and it actually works fine for this operation. It's not so great for forming things, it's a little bit bendy. You can even just fashion something out of a piece of wood or bamboo that's the right shape, or there's just a plain brass one here with no handle on that I use for larger reeds. So we're going to pop that on there. I'm going to use my pliers. These are just ordinary pliers from Homebase, nothing fancy. I'm going to lift up the bit of wire that's twisted so it's sticking out. There's a slim possibility that this wire might break, and if it does, then we'll just replace it with a new one. Okay, so having got that standing up, I'm now going to grab a hold of it. I'm going to pull away and then twist. And this one is twisted the opposite direction to what I usually do. I like to do them so that they do up clockwise, like a screw would, but this one is anti-clockwise. It's not one that I made. So I'll try that with a different angle on the camera. I'm going to pull away and twist. And then once that's done, I'll just lie that back down again. And it hasn't broken. If it does, the simplest thing to replace it with, you can either buy proper bassoon wire from bassoon supplier, for example Howarth, or this is actually from the beading shop. So this is slightly thinner. I use it for my shawm reeds, and it says Trimmett's beading wire 24 gauge, and that's brass, and that works just the same way. Okay, let's have a look at this one and see if it's dry. Yes, my thumb is failing to stick to it. Huzzah. So the other thing I need to do with this one, I noticed, is that if I look through it, you're not going to see this on the camera necessarily, but if you were to hold that up to your eye and have a look through to the light, you would see little splinters of cane in there. So I'm going to have a poke around in there and get rid of those because they're going to be blocking the airflow. And again, there's a range of tools you can use. So the official bassoon tool for this would be a reamer. This is a diamond reamer. That's why it's sparkling in the light there. But basically, all you need, the equivalent would be some kind of a needle. It's stuck in the packet. So that can do exactly the same job. In fact, I shall use that one, which is about a tenth of the cost to buy. So I'm just going to put that in there gently, and this is why I want this to be dry, because those splinters will just fall off if I poke at them. So a little bit of rotation. You can use a needle file, or you can use a slightly flatter one like this, and then just check again that you can see through. I haven't quite got them. I shall try that kind of movement. Are they gone? No, they're not. They must be a very long way in. Let's have a go with this one then. This is actually designed to make the base of the reed ever so slightly bigger, so you don't want to go too far with it because it will make it fit slightly further down under a staple. That seems to have got them. Right, anything else on my dry list? Let me have a look before we soak anything or take any questions. Oh yes, super gluing cracks in the blade. This is a fun one. So if you get a proper crack in the blade of your reed, that's not showing up on there, is it? Oh, there you go. You can see a line here. That you can actually, all is not lost, you can actually super glue it. That shows a bit better when I put that in because as soon as I put the plaque in between the blades, it forces it to open a little bit. So we're going to do exactly the same thing with my lovely Loctite. We're going to put a tiny dab of super glue just on the crack. And then the important thing is not to leave too much excess. So I'm going to put it on and I'm immediately going to take this out. I have in the past super glued one of these inside a reed. That wasn't pretty, so you need to be pretty quick. And I've then got some kitchen paper with me, ready to remove any excess on the outside. If you end up with more glue on the blade, it's going to act like a bit of a dampener of the vibrations. So it'll basically make the reed quieter and a bit more muffled sounding, but it might still work. Right, so let's sort this one out. This is the Sawdoon reed, by the way. That's why it's so absolutely huge, but it does make it a bit easier for you guys to see. So here we go. Wish me luck. Tiny dab of super glue in the crack, relatively quickly. Plastic out, excess off, and I'm just going to very gently push it so that it comes together. And then we'll count to 10, hold our breath, and hope. Not that I really need this reed to work. I've been rifling through all sorts of old boxes that are on the shelf of examples of things and reeds people have given me that I never use to work on today. Unfortunately, my own reeds, they're all in relatively good nicks, so not great for demonstrating on. Okay, and when I let go, that doesn't come back apart, so I think it's fixed. It's actually got a crack on the other side as well, this one. It's completely dead. Right, let's put the lid back on my super glue. I think if I was doing a serious job on this, I might actually go again because it's such a big crack. Yes, it's still there. I might give it another go. A bit more. Try not to super glue my plaque to the tablecloth. So many possibilities with super glue of things that can go wrong, aren't there? Lovely. I think we're going to declare that one fixed. Okay, those are all the dry rescue operations. Um, does anybody have any questions so far before we move on to things that we're going to do on wet reeds? I'm going to put some in water, in fact, while we're thinking about that. Feel free to either unmute and ask or type in the chat, otherwise I shall plough on regardless. Little and large in here, I think. Try various things. Okay, in that case, while those are soaking, I'm going to run through a few, oh, replacing the wire. Yes, I will do that in a minute. That's a good idea. Yes, in that case, I'm going to run through a couple of do's and don'ts of things that you might do regularly that might actually be damaging your reeds. So it depends what kind of box you've got, but it's best to make sure that your reed is dry when you put it away. And preferably that your box has got some kind of ventilation. So if you want to invest in a nice bassoon reed box, which is especially made for the job, you'll see this has got holes on the side which are there to let the air flow through so that these are always ventilated. If, however, you've got a nice plastic lidded box or a tin or something and you put the lid down after you've played and you come back a few weeks later, you're liable to find that your reeds have gone mouldy, and that's not a lot of fun. When we send reads out to customers, we put them in these little plastic tubes that you can get. And Eric, when we buy a batch of those, we'll get 100 tubes, and I will walk into the workshop and say, please, can you drill holes in all these? And he has to make tiny little vent holes in them all because we have had that happen to us as well. And the other thing about storage, cotton wool. If you've got cotton wool in your reed box, please throw it away. It's awful stuff. It sticks to the blades and bungs things up. So if you have just got an ordinary plastic box or a cardboard box with your reeds in, kitchen towels are a lot better. Or anything that doesn't come apart, you end up with fluff everywhere. And the third thing I was going to talk about in terms of not damaging things is how you handle reeds when you're putting them on and off the instrument. So I've got a shawl here. And I'll show you a couple of things that I have seen regularly. So the first thing is how you hold your reed when you're putting it on and off, and that's what the Turk's head, the binding where it all crosses over, is kind of for. That's a kind of a handle. So if you use that for grip, ideally, that is how you should be doing it. If you grip it on the blades, you're actually going to adjust it effectively. So if the reed is too open and you really want to close it, then you could do that, but it's not ideal. So yeah, use that there. And the other thing is to make sure that you're going straight up and down. So I had one person in particular I used to teach, and she would go sideways around the corner like that as she went on. And that is one sure way to make sure you get splinters of cane in the middle of that bore there. And also, if you are getting those splinters, it's worth checking the top of your staple, because if that's a bit sharp, it will do that more than it should. And you can get some very fine sandpaper maybe and just very carefully blunten that off, and that will help fix that problem. Okay, let's do some wire replacement before I forget. Let's go back to that one where I tightened it. I'll change back onto the other camera. So let's take this off. That snapped. That is quite old, that wire. So that's come off. And you can see there's a line on the cane which shows exactly where it goes. You'll tend to get a dent on either side, in fact, which will show you where it should sit. If you get a reed out of the box that's been in the box for ages, and you can see where that dent is, and the reed is sitting, the wire rather, is sitting somewhere else further down, it's definitely worth pushing it back up. Right, let's put a new wire on this then. So I'll use the bassoon wire since it's a slightly larger one. Cut myself a piece. There we go. Just tuck the end back in. Okay. So I'm going to do this my way around. I've got one end sticking out here, which is going to be one half of my twist. So I support it on the back, and I'm going to go across the front, round the back, and to the front again. I've actually allowed myself more wire than I need, but that's okay. So it's going round twice. See two curves there, two there. And one of the important things is to make sure it's not crossing over itself, because then it will be quite hard to get it to pull tight. So make sure that you've got effectively parallel lines going on. And then you take those two ends and you twist to do it up. You start off with your fingers. So now we've got a rough twist on there. I'll cut off the excess. Let's get the mandrel in it so I've got something to hold on to. And then it's the same process I was talking about. So we're going to take those ends, we're going to pull them away from the reed, and then almost release as we twist. So it's two different movements. It's pull away and then twist. Just get that to sit in the old dents. Do that on the other angle. So pull and then twist. If you go too far, the wire will snap and you'll have to start again, but you just kind of have to get a feel for how much give there is in the wire. Okay? And cut off a bit more of the excess if there's too much of it. That's my hands all over the screen. And then use your pliers or your fingers to bend the end down. And we've got a new wire on there. Right, okay, wet operations then. So we're going to have a look. Oh, hello. Question. How do you figure out The reed is a problem. It's not making a noise, or it's completely and utterly out of tune, or it might just be that it's becoming extremely hard work. Different problems will create different kinds of sounds or sensations when you're playing. So, for example, we're about to look at cleaning gunk out of your reed. What happens if your reed is gunky is just that it gets quieter and quieter at the same time as getting harder and harder to blow. You might find that if you've not played a reed for ages, it's become very open. We're going to have a look at opening and closing it in a minute. And if it's very open, it'll be hard to blow, but when you do blow, it'll be really loud. So each problem has got its own kind of uh, both sound way of diagnosing it and also the feel of it when you're blowing down it. Right, so as you blow down a reed, I'm afraid to say various bits of food, um, skin will eventually accumulate. And it depends how big your reed is, uh, how soon you'll notice that effect. So if I fish in this water, in fact, I've got one of my tiny little ones. This is my soprano reed for the Cronin soprano. As you can see, it's very small, and so I usually notice very quickly if this one's getting bumped up because there's hardly any space in it at all. And my solution to this, for a start, is to get a plaque. There are two of these I'm using, by the way. This is a bassoon plaque, the big one, and the little one is an oboe plaque. If you haven't got one, you can do this job simply by using a piece of old paper and fishing around inside. So what I'm going to do is put the plaque between the two blades, and then I'm going to very gently push upwards on the inside, and as I come out, there's a tiny amount of dirt on there, which you won't see, I'm pleased to say. If it's been years and you've never done this, the effects can be quite dramatic. This was worth doing, but it's not going to show a huge amount on camera. I just rotated, so I'm doing the other blade now. You can also go out through the sides very gently. And you can also effectively scrape. This is quite a good way to practice scraping before you learn to do it with a knife, because all you want to do is take any dirt off the outside. It just gives you a feel for it. And if you do that to your reed, you might be quite surprised what ends up on the edge of the plastic there. This is up on one side, I might put it together. And then to clean the tube at the base, you can either use a pipe cleaner, a little one here, and poke that in there gently, or, ooh, yes, something's definitely coming out. You can use a brush. In fact, I have been known to use these TP brushes that you can get from between your teeth. This is a particularly huge one for teeth. In fact, I'm going to use that for a bigger reed. Or you can actually buy a brush from Riga that is specifically for bassoon reeds. That's also an option. So that can go in there. So keep it fairly gentle. And you may or may not get some stuff out. While you're at it, it's probably worth cleaning the staple of your instrument and possibly the top of your instrument as well. Be a bit careful about that. If it's a very old instrument, or if it's been kept a bit damp and the wood is starting to get a bit soft, you don't want to go too far with that kind of thing. But just very gently with a pipe cleaner, it's worth seeing what's in there. I have come across instruments where the staple hasn't been going all the way into the instrument anymore. They're playing flat, and it's simply because there's 2 millimeters worth of dirt in the bottom of that bit at the top of the instrument where the staple goes in, and the staple won't go all the way into the instrument anymore. So let's try a little bit of cleaning on something a bit bigger, see if we get anything more visible. If not, we shall move on to the next thing. Yeah. See, all my reeds are too clean for this. Okay, and that one probably will take the brush. It's stuck. No, it isn't. It's all good. Um, there is another way, actually. There are two other ways, one of which I don't have. I know my colleague Belinda Paul uses a sonic jewellery cleaner for this. So if you've got one of those or you fancy investing, you can put your reeds in water in this thing and it will jiggle them, and all the dirt will fall off. Or the other thing she's recommended to me is this rather wonderful syringe, which you can fill up with water and insert in the base of your reed and fire water across the room. I would only do that in the kitchen sink, so you're not getting a live demo of that one today. Okay, any further questions before we move on? Show you my face again for a bit and have a little bit of tidy up before we go to the next bit. Hello. Everywhere, all over the table already. Dirt all over the tablecloth. And water all over the tablecloth. Brilliant. Yes, please, Eric. Could you get me a tea towel? Can you rescue a really old reed? Sometimes, yes. The bigger they are, the longer they last. If you're not playing them regularly, they will last fairly well. So if you've got something sitting in a box that is 20, 30 years old, it's always worth a try. And it's all good practice. So if you, could you get me some more water as well? Thank you. If you're not sure, give it a go because at least you've practiced the techniques, and the next time you try them on a reed that maybe does have more chance of being rescued, it won't be the first time you've done it. So this is a low risk way of getting into it basically and getting used to the tactile nature of handling the materials and the tools and so on. How long to soak before cleaning? If I'm going to play, I tend to literally dunk and then take out and leave it on one side for 5 minutes. I might actually leave it in the water for 5 to 10 minutes before I cleaning. It's just long enough for all that stuff to loosen up basically and let go. The worst case I've ever had to clean up of this was when I took over playing soprano crumhorn with the York Waits, and the soprano crumhorn was presented to me, and nobody had played it for the last 10 years. And before that, it had been played by someone who used to eat biscuits while they were playing. And bear in mind, this is a capped reed, it's not even in your mouth, but it was a millimetre thick in dirt inside and out. And it took me a good 10 or 15 minutes of soak, scrape, to rediscover the cane underneath. And it did eventually work. So it can be surprising what you can rescue. It's always worth a try. You've got nothing to lose, basically, if something has stopped working. Uh, I think one book advised drawing a dollar bill through the blades. Yeah, I suppose that would be a bit stiffer than an ordinary piece of paper. I know that sometimes when people use paper for cleaning between the blades, it can sometimes disintegrate, and then you end up with paper inside your reed, and then you have to figure out how to get that out. So I guess, especially now, actually, our British currency is plastic, so that's quite handy if you want to use that. It's not going to fall apart, a bit more sturdy than your average piece of printed paper. Okay, right. Let me just check how far down my list we have got. Clean between the blades of the plaque, we've done that. Clean the tube, we've done that. Clean the outside, we've done that. Adjusting the tip opening by squeezing the wires. Okay, this is important stuff. So this might be something you need to do to an old reed that has stopped working. As you play, they gradually tend to close up. So they'll get more and more closed, and eventually you might need to open them. If they've been in the box for ages, they tend to open up. So you might need to close them down before you can actually get any air through them at all. And it's also a useful thing to adjust if the weather's changed or if you've got a reed that you've just bought. They tend to be quite open when they're new and need closing down and so on. So I'm going to work on something big-ish so you can see it. Change back over to the reed camera. So we'll go for this, which is bassoon reed sized and has 3 wires. Some reeds have 3 wires, some have 2. So there's the one you can see at the top, the one I just replaced. There's one right at the top of the binding here, which is the one that you might or might not get depending. And then there's one, like I said, under the Turk's head. There's one under the Turk's head we'd leave alone. Nothing happens to that. As long as that's round at the base, all is well with the world. So we're going to work on the top 2. And we're going to be looking at the gap between the blades at the tip. So what you want to see there is something that is closer together at the edges and wider at the middle. And depending how wide that is, it will be harder to blow. If it's wider, it will be flatter in pitch. And because what happens when you play is that those 2 blades have got to come together and close and open really, really fast. That's what actually makes the vibration. So you've got to think about how easy is it to make that shut. And you can test that with your fingers on top and bottom like that, close it and open it. Now, if it's a reed that goes in your mouth, then the shape is likely to be, like I say, narrower at the edges, bigger in the middle. If it's a capped reed, then it might be a bit more parallel because you haven't got your lips doing that job. So you want the whole thing to open and close together. In an ideal world, you'll be looking at something symmetrical. So both blades will be curving the same amount, and they'll be curving the same on the left as they are on the right. If not, we're going to get into scraping in a little while, and we'll look at how to sort that. So if you are finding it's hard to blow, the pitch is flat, and it's hard to get the upper register, your reed is too open, you want to close it down. If you've got strong fingers, you can literally do this with your fingers. If it's a bit harder work, then you can use the pliers on the reed. If you're using pliers, be gentle. If you're using your fingers, you might need to work quite hard at it. So if I want to close this down, I'm quite literally going to take the top wire on either side, and I'm just going to squeeze. And for me, it's both fingers and thumbs job. If I overdo it, that'll actually end up completely shut, but that's just got a bit smaller, that opening. And so that will take the pitch up, it will make it easier to blow, and it should make it easier to get up into the second register. If it's very quiet, it's sharp, and you're squeaking at the bottom of the instrument, in other words, it's firing up into the second register when you don't want it to, then you need to open it. So you're going to go the other way, you're going to put your finger and thumb on the sides of that top wire and do exactly the same thing. And as you're doing this, you want to be looking at that tip opening to see what effect you're having. And you'll find it'll get bigger and bigger, and then when you let go, it'll snap back a little bit. But that is now slightly bigger than it was when I started. I'm just going to get this angle so that it's a bit more like where my eyes are. There we go. So I can, since I don't actually use this reed, I can take a bit of a risk. I can do the pliers version. Let's see what happens if we go a bit further. So they get bigger and bigger, and when I let go, it snaps back a little bit. Close it back down again until it's completely shut if need be. Okay, somewhere in the middle. Now, if you've got 3 wires on a reed, you have the option of using the next one down, the middle wire, and that works the opposite way. So if I was to squeeze on that second wire, front and back, instead of closing the reed, it should open it. Yes. And if I squeeze on the sides of the second wire, instead of opening it, it should close it. There we go. So, this is something John Hanchett was quite keen on. You've got a reed that's just not right somehow. It's old and cranky and it doesn't behave anymore. You can try going for the same tip opening, but by squeezing both wires. So you can think, well, it's not behaving, but it is the right pitch and it is the right pressure. So I'm just going to squeeze them both on the sides and they will counteract each other. And sometimes, by some kind of weird reed magic, that is enough to make it behave itself again. So it's worth fiddling with. It's one of these wonderful, what he used to refer to as reversible changes. And we like to try the reversible changes before we try the irreversible ones, obviously, because you can always put it back. So that's reed squeezing. I'm also ever so tempted with this one. The blades are ever so slightly askew. So no, my wrists won't do that. So they're just ever so slightly sitting like that instead of parallel to each other. So I'm going to, at that first wire, see if I can put them back. A bit of a twisty squeeze. Yes, that's a bit better. Right, so that is reed squeezing, wire squeezing. It's definitely worth getting used to and getting familiar with because it's something you can do very quickly in the middle, between pieces, in the middle of a performance even. You can just get your fingers on there, give it a quick squeeze, and things will change. But obviously, if you've never done it before, then the middle of a concert is not the best time to do it for the first time. So practice, experiment, get used to what happens after each move and how it affects the way that the reed feels when you're playing on it and how it affects the way it sounds and how it behaves. So let's have a quick look at scraping as well. So like I said, what you ideally want is symmetry. So if I get the really, really big one and have a look down that, it's a bit easier to point at. So you want both blades to have the same amount of curvature on them, and you want them to curve the same amount on the left as they do on the right. And if one blade is sticking up more than the other, or if one side is sticking up more than the other, then what that means is that that bit that's sticking up is stronger. And so you literally scrape the bit that sticks up. And that way, gradually, it should settle into a symmetrical shape. And the reason you want that symmetrical shape is so that that tip opening will open and close nicely. I won't squeeze that one too much, it's dry, it might crack. So let's have a go. This one is not entirely symmetrical. It's a little bit more closed on this side than it is on this side. So I'm going to have a go at scraping this one and see if I can make that settle down a bit. So to scrape a reed, I'm going to get my mandrel again. Again, if you haven't got one, just stick it on the staple of your instrument. It just gives a bit of stability here and something to put in your hand. I'm going to put the plaque between the blades. Again, it's not 100% essential, but it does make life easier. And then you're going to choose a knife. Now, I've brought three today. This is a simple and cheap option, the Opinel. It's quite readily available and it's a carbon blade and quite easy to sharpen. Or specialist reed knives come in two types. This one is a symmetrical one, so it's what's called a hollow blade. It dips in on both sides and it's therefore either right or left-handed. Or you can have a one-sided one. This is mine, which is right-handed. So it is flat on this side and has a bevel on this side, so that when I'm scraping away from me, basically it's the burrs on the metal are almost curving up like that. Which side of this was which? Oh yes, I was going to do that side. So when you're scraping, you want to be relatively gentle if you're doing small adjustments like this. So my finger is underneath to support the reed. My thumb is going to be on the back of the blade like that. And I'm just going to very gently remove a bit of cane. So because that side was more open, I'm going to do the right hand side on this side and then flip it over and do the left hand side on that blade and see if that closes down a little bit. Had no effect whatsoever. I shall do some more. Mind you, this reed probably has sat in a box for 20 years. Probably got definite ideas about what shape it is by now. I'm not entirely kidding either. Sometimes it's worth doing a bit of work on a reed and then putting it away for a day and coming back the next day to see how it's reacted, because they can take a while. That's now a little bit more symmetrical than it was. Sorry, I'm pointing it at my screen rather than at my lens. Yes. Okay. So, other reasons that you might be scraping. Let's have a look. I have a little list for this as well. Oh yes, if it's really stuffy. So if you've got the tone's not very clear, then the best place to scrape for that is on the tip. So just the sort of 2 or 3 millimeters, depending how big your reed is proportionally, along the tip here. So exactly the same method. The plaque back in, and I would literally, from where my blade is now to the tip, just take a bit off all the way across, trying to be relatively even about it, so I do the same amount on both sides. When you're doing that, you want your blade to go beyond the tip so it actually comes down onto the plaque. So you're not leaving a ridge of cane along the tip here, because that can be. Are you scraping on a dry or wet reed? It says. I knew because Eric started writing things down for me. Wet. Yes, I always scrape on wet cane, and if you're in a hot environment, dry environment, it's actually worth dipping between. So every few minutes you put it back in the water and just let it get wet again. Um, with capped reeds, which effectively you might want to work when they're dry, then towards the end of the process I might do some of it on dry cane, but that's quite unusual for me. Most of the time I'm working on wet cane. It's just that bit more flexible. There's always a risk when your cane is dry that you put a bit of pressure on it and it just snaps. So if it's wet, it's a little bit bendier in every direction, and that means that things like putting the plaque in are a lot less risky because it's not so brittle. Okay. Look back at my list. What else have we got? the reed is just really hard work, then it's probably too strong all over. So the tip scraping I just showed you would be my first plan of attack. And then if it's still not working, then I would start working on either side and kind of around here. So what you want to do the least to is the kind of ridge down the middle. If you imagine almost a flame shape. In fact, if I get my pencil. So they sometimes call it the flame or the heart. It's kind of this bit here is kind of where the guts of the reed lie, and I would do the least there. This is definitely talking about Shoreham and Kirtle reeds at this point. The Crumhorn ones are more of a flat lay, so you scrape all over. So I would take cane off everywhere but that middle section I've just drawn on there. So I'd go down the sides. I would go across here, other side, across here, and then obviously turn it over and do the same on the other blade. And if it's still too hard, then I would start thinking about taking some off in that middle section that I drew on as well, until it works. Little and often, keep trying it, keep playing it in between times. Again, get a feel for what each thing that you do is actually, what effect it's having on the reed. So don't just sit there and scrape and scrape and scrape and scrape, and then you go to play it and it's dead, because you can't put it back. We're on to irreversible changes now. So yes, a little bit of scraping, little bit of playing, little bit of scraping, little bit of playing, just working and seeing what the effects are. Again, experiment on reeds that are older and a bit more worn out, or reeds that you otherwise think are just not going to work for you, before you start doing anything to something you actually like. Okay, that is actually everything I've got scraping. The other thing I was going to do was just show you how to cut the tip off. So I quite often come across people who say, this instrument's really, really flat. What can I do about it? And the simplest thing you can do about it, actually, and this is what I do to my own reeds, um, is just to take the tip off the reed until it's in tune. So I'm literally going to take about 0.5 millimeter off the end. This is called a cutting block. It's just a piece of hardwood. Any piece of wood will do. So I also sometimes, if I haven't got any block with me, I'll actually use the back of my reed box there. I've got a patch of tape on there that I forlornly hope might protect the wood. And I'm going to take my ordinary penknife, and I'm literally, see if I can get this to show. Yeah. So I'm literally going to take a tiny stripe off the end. Again, make it small because you can always do it again. And make sure it's straight. Push on the top. And we've removed just that much cane from the tip. And that might take it up 10, 20 cents or so. So you can just do that a few times. Obviously, if you take quite a lot off the tip, then the scraping you've done at the tip, some of it's going to disappear, so you might need to then scrape it a bit more at the tip or a bit further back just to loosen that up again. But it's a great way to bring the pitch up on an instrument if you're otherwise struggling with that, because it's just so much hard work, isn't it? If you're blowing down an instrument and it's just not coming up to the same pitch as the people around you. So if you've got a band that generally plays sharp, just have one reed that you have a bit shorter that you can take out and play with that band. It's a bit of a balancing act. So the thing with double reed instruments is that even with exactly the same setup and the same instrument, no two people are going to come out sounding the same or at the same pitch. It's just one of those rules of life. So you've got to be a bit adjustable and a bit flexible, prepared to tinker with things. I actually have, for example, two different setups almost, depending whether I'm playing with the York Waits, who are quite loud, who tend to play out of doors a lot, or whether I'm playing with Blondell, who are more often indoors playing concerts rather than processions. And I will walk into the room for rehearsal, and if it's the York Waits, I will open my reed up using the wires like I showed you, and push the staple right in. And if I'm playing with Blondell, that reed will get closed down a little bit, and it might well be that I need to pull the staple out because the closing of the reed makes the pitch sharper. And then to compensate for that, I pull the staple out to bring the pitch back down again. So yes, if you're playing with several different groups, it's worth being a bit chameleonic about it, being prepared to fit in and do things their way. Right, have we got more questions? Because that is actually as far as I was expecting to go. Although I have got some other things I can show you if there's nobody else that wants to ask anything. How many people are still here? Oh, 50 people. Quite impressed. Nobody typing anything? Right then. In that case, what else could we have a look at? Actually, so the plan is, oh, thanks, Paul. The plan is that I was going to do this eventually as a YouTube video or two. So I'm going to have one that will be on rescuing an old read, maybe one that is on adjusting a new read, and then the next YouTube video after that will be how to finish an unfinished read, which I'm going to start selling. So you'll be able to buy them with me with the tips still. In fact, I've got some over here. So the tip is still actually joined where it's folded in half, and you would have to cut that off yourself and do your own scraping. So here, ooh, here is my soprano shorn reed that I was working on earlier, and here is an unfinished example of the same. So you can see the pencil mark on the tip, which shows you where you would cut it off, and then you'd have to do quite a lot of scraping to get that working for you. So that's an unfinished reed, and then after that it would be how to actually bend the cane in half to make that, to form it. And then after that, you have to shape your own cane and start kind of from the beginning and so on. So if you don't follow me on YouTube or Facebook at the moment, it could be worth doing so because those will be along sometime between now and Christmas. Stuart, hello Stuart. Cross blades. Yes, it's something that they're especially prone to on reeds with 2 wires, but it does happen with reeds with 3 wires. I did try to show you a little bit on the bassoon reed. So it's literally a question of getting your fingers on that first wire, but one is slightly to the front and one is slightly to the back, and a kind of a crossways squeeze. And you have to go beyond um, them being straight because they will come back a bit. So you literally, if they're like that, you're going to go until they're almost like that, and then when you let go, hopefully they'll land back in line. You have to be a bit brave with it. Again, experiment on one that's not working to begin with and see how you get on with that. Will a player in a modern group or orchestra be doing the same maintenance on their wind instruments? If they're a double reed player, then yes, they will. Absolutely. Oboe reeds, modern oboe reeds, are constructed slightly differently. So they're tied onto the staple, the brass staple that on a shawm is part of the instrument. With a modern oboe, that is part of the reed. And that goes also for our crumple reeds, some over here. So this has got a brass staple to which it's permanently attached. And when you buy a new reed, a new staple will come with it. Actually, crumpons, you can have them either way. So sometimes they're built on and sometimes they pop on and off, depending what make and model you've got. But yes, a lot of these tools, the knives that I use and all the stuff I was talking about being Riga tools, they are modern bassoon tools. So these reeds that I make, they've got more in common with bassoon reeds than oboe reeds in that respect. Even the shawm reeds are kind of like bassoon reeds, but scaled down to be tiny. Andy Hornby. Oh, you have an instrument with no reed. Andy, could you unmute yourself and tell me what kind of instrument you're talking about?
Hi, Lizzie. Thanks very much.
That's all right.
Well, various things. I kind of like drilling holes in bits of wood and making, primitive sort of shawmy things. I'd play Rouse Fife, but that's got a really thick, massive plastic reed in, which I don't touch much. But if you have a pipe and it's got holes in, is there a sort of way of getting a vague idea of how long the reed lips should be?
It's about the combined length of the reed and the staple. So, for example, for me, at the moment, my C soprano reed is that one. My alto reed is the same but smaller. And that's because the alto has got a longer staple on it. Sorry, I've got my not mirroring on, which is why I keep veering off to the other side.
Yeah.
So they are actually the same shape, but different sizes. So it's a total of the internal volume of those two things that makes a difference. Um, are you making your own staples as well?
Yeah, I kind of bagpipe style. I make them on the brass staple,
Right. Yeah.
and I'm usually making plastic reeds actually.
Yeah. I mean, I've been making crumhorn reeds for makes of instrument that I've not come across before in the last year or two. And generally with that, I make them as big as I dare, and then I just keep cutting bits off until I arrive at the pitch I want. So that's one way to come at it. It could be worth getting some bassoon shaped cane and doing that. So start with something that's actually bassoon sized almost and just take off either end. So you can take off the tube end as well as the blade end,
Yeah,
although you'll have to reconstruct your binding each time and see how far you have to go before you arrive on the right pitch.
it's all great fun.
Yep, sounds like that should keep you busy for the winter.
It will do. Yeah, thanks very much.
You're welcome. Are there any extant read examples? No, which is a shame actually, because I recently discovered I thought there weren't any from before the Baroque times. There are for Aulos. So 2,000 years ago, yes, there are extant examples, but for the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, we haven't got any. So it's all basically trying things until you find out what works. There is some written documentation about it. It's kind of on the cusp between Renaissance and Baroque, so late 17th century. I think it's called the Talbot manuscript. But even that, it's by then the shawm was beginning to turn into an oboe, so it's kind of a transitional instrument. So for for the Middle Ages, there really isn't much to go on. It's just a question of copying the instrument and then popping different things on the top until you find something that sounds nice. Very often, what we haven't got also is the staple or the top of the instrument because these are the bits that rot. So you might have an extant instrument in a museum, or these days for the Middle Ages, you're starting to find things that are actually being found in drains and old toilets and all sorts. And the bit where the staple goes into the instrument is the first bit to give out and to change shape and to rot away. So if you haven't got that socket, then you really don't know what size the staple was either, which is a shame because that's part of the bore. So it does make a difference. I guess that's why there's so much variety between different makers and their different interpretations and reproductions. So it very much depends who you bought your instrument from as to what shape and size your reed is going to be. Any tips on keeping the knives sharp? I've recently invested in a quite large whetstone from Lakeland Plastics, which is quite nice. They've got them for kitchen knives, and yeah, that's worth a go because I used to use the little dinky ones, and then you're fiddling around. It's the same size as the knife, and it's quite fiddly. But if you've got something you can pop on the table and literally just work over, then that's a lot easier. Right.